for making the right purchase, for building your wealth, for doing the right thing. So he's not just a sales guy, as I'm saying, he has your best interest at heart, and I think that's really important. You should check out his blog. He has great blog posts on there on different topics, and he does YouTube videos, and he's forward-thinking in that respect. And yeah, I'm really excited about his brokerage firm that he's building, and you want to see those signs, DCF, around more and more in the year to come. So looking forward to your presentation, David.
Thanks, man. That was like sincere. Okay, so thank you for the introduction again. And so today I'm going to talk to you about, mostly I'm going to focus on house maintenance. And then I'm going to talk about the different components so we can educate each other, or so I can educate you guys on what's important when it comes to house maintenance. So here's the outline. So we're going to talk about roofs, drainage, windows, foundation, the grounds, and HVAC. So the roof, generally in a house, is asphalt roof, and there's 3-tab shingles, which are the most common. They're like the flat, simple shingles. They usually have about a 20-year shelf life or install life. And then there's laminate architectural shingles. Those are the ones that look like they're 3D. And then there's metal shingles and cedar shakers. So 3-tab, as I said, is the most common. Laminate or architectural shingles, they have supposedly, we don't know yet because they've only been around for 10 years, about 40-year shelf life, or installation life. And then metal roofs, something a lot of people don't know, is yes, they last a long time, but the screws that go in to connect them need to be resealed every 5 to 6 years, I've been told. And then cedar shakers, shingles, those aren't as popular, they're quite expensive, and they'll last at least 40 years. And then we need to talk about, for a second here, ventilation and insulation. So ventilation, when you look at a roof, there's usually little caps on them, and then the insulation sits on the ceiling. So basically on the ceiling, and then the roof is like a triangle, right? And then there's air that circulates through, and it's very important to have the adequate amount of insulation. The higher the R value, the better it'll insulate. And so when you're looking at redoing your roof, you want to ask yourself, what is the best type of roof material for you? And then while you're at it, you might as well look at the insulation and then the ventilation. Okay, this was a house that Louise and I looked at for fun. And wow, this isn't a house, but this is on the top of I think this 2.5 level or second level. And there's a little balcony. And I thought, well, here's a perfect example of looking at all different kinds of shingles, except for cedar shakers on this photo. So these are the architectural ones. You can see they look almost 3-dimensional. And then this is just a strip of asphalt shingle that's usually used on things like sheds and stuff like that. This is the 3-tab shingle here. And then here is a 3-tab shingle that looks like it's near its end. And it's hard to gauge how long your shingles have to go, but usually once they start curling and degranulating, because there's basically sand granulars on them, that's when you should look at changing them. And it's always best to put your asphalt shingles on when it's really hot outside, because that seals them together. And a lot of builders will put them on any time of the year. We've heard of stories where shingles have just flown off in the wind because they haven't sealed in the heat. They were installed in the winter or the fall. That's not the greatest idea. This is the house that I help my clients buy. The condition finalizes today. These are cedar shingles. So they're actual cedar plank pieces, and they actually keep water out. It's amazing. There's no rubber sealing or anything like that. Drainage, we need to talk about eaves and gutters. Lots of common sense there. It's good to clear them every season, every transitional season, so fall and spring. And a lot of people can do them themselves. Downspouts are important. So you have the eaves and then the downspout. Sometimes the downspout disconnects from the eave and then you have leaking. And sometimes downspouts get clogged. You can always pay someone to do them. And you also want to have a positive grade. So when you look at a house, you want the grade to be like this, sloping away, not a negative grade, something like this. And your sump pump system. It's important that you make sure your hose to your sump pump is pointed away from the house. I know it sounds very like, of course, but a lot of people don't do it properly. Here's an example of a house that I showed some clients, and I thought this is a good basic example of what a positive grade is. So you can see here, here's the neighbor's fence, this is the house, and the land is slightly tilted this way. And it's not to say that the water is to just go in the neighbor's yard. The idea is that the neighbor will have the opposite on their side, and it'll create a channel for water to drain.
Is that my house?
I believe it is. Because I knew I showed it to this house.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's my house.
Wow. And look at Lisa's house. It has
Beautiful.
So yes. So here's the eaves,
I love the front.
the downspout, and look, the downspout is pointed out right away from the house. So very good, Lisa. I wasn't sure.
I thought this was going to be like a terrible example. I would never sell this.
That sounds so bad.
Here's a house where, so this is the garage. Here's a downspout, but it's not obviously elbowed out away from the garage. But this here is like a grid with an interior or underground drainage system that goes all the way to the front of the house into the street. So if somebody like you is thinking, maybe I need to change your driveway, maybe you need to repave it, or in this case, interlock and brick, maybe re-level it and reinstall it, it doesn't hurt to consider putting in an integrated drainage system. And that's nice because you don't have to trip on them and always clear them. Windows, different materials, wood, metal, PVC, fiberglass. PVC and fiberglass are the most common, and that's the framing. Of course, glass is glass, and then wood and metal. There are older metal and newer metal window frames. The metal sliders are typically the older ones from usually the 70s, 60s, and then there's commercial ones that have metal, like aluminum cladding, and those are newer. There's different types of panes. Usually the more the better, so 3 pane is the most you can get. Argon filled or gas filled, another gas. And you can actually tell what kind of windows you have by putting your ring up against, at least some of those too, against the windows, and you can see how many reflections there are. So if you need to change your windows, it's a good idea to try to get triple pane. Allow you for more insulation. And it's a good idea to remove your screens every winter. And the reason why is because the screens actually build all kinds of basically crud and gross stuff from ventilation, and then it clogs the little squares. And what happens is then the windows can't breathe. And when that happens, it starts to maybe create mold or mildew, but then also condensation, and it weakens the seals. That's all from the inside. So you don't want to have heavy curtains and heavy blinds always covering your windows if possible, especially in the winter. Here's an example of some windows. This is a PVC frame, and you can see they have channels for air insulation. And here's 3 pieces of glass, that's triple pane. Here's a double, so you get that in. Okay, foundations. The most common type of foundation is a footing. That's where you have basically a square donut, and then the house foundation sits on top of that. Piles are now the standard with all new house builds. That's where you have concrete, basically post that's drilled in, usually 40, 50 feet in the ground. A typical bungalow would have 28 piles, and then the house sits on that. And then you have a weeping tile system with all houses that are built now, where it's usually on the exterior, and it's a PVC tube with holes in it. It's perforated and allows the water to get in. It channels into, it's only perforated on the top, then it channels through into a pit, and then the pit pumps, or the sump pump pumps the water out of the pit. And hydraulic pressure, we should talk about that. That's water pressure from the outside of the foundation. Typically, you see that on the walls. Now, we've had a very dry spring, so it's important that people in a really dry spring, or dry summer, to actually water around their house, because there have been stories I've heard of where foundations have basically popped or cracked because they've had so much pressure relieved from the exterior that it puts so much pressure on the foundation that it will either buckle or cave in and create a huge crack. That's something that we haven't experienced in many years. We see a lot of hydraulic pressure coming from the floors too, and that can create the floor to buckle or cave in. And a lot of that happens with piled houses. The house I just showed you with the shaker shingles that my client bought, it's built on piles, but the floor actually buckled up, and that's pretty normal. Unfortunately, builders are not required to prepare the soil by compacting it and then putting in the floor. So they do the bare minimum, and that's what happens. So he has to prepare to take out all the concrete and redo it. And that's the price of, unfortunately, piled houses. Here's an example of a house on Kingston Road. I used to live on Kingston Road. This is an example of actually a good foundation repair. You can see these lines are just concrete, fresh concrete that's covering up a crack, or several cracks. And these are basically like I-beams or T-beams that go this much into the ground. So they're drilled in, they go to about 10 feet, 15 feet, sometimes in the ground, and they brace the house. And typically what they would do, the foundation person would do the same thing on the outside and pin them together. And that will support the wall. Looking at this will scare a lot of buyers, but in fact this could be even stronger than the original house foundation. Here's a house that I sold for my client. He bought this house and he wasn't using me, and then I ended up selling for him. This is an example of a foundation where the footing is exposed. So usually the footing is underground. And you can see there's many different elements here that are happening. You have S-fluorescence, which is salt. That's an indication of moisture. You can actually see staining of water and then rotten wood. This is what happens when the house doesn't have proper drainage. And every foundation problem I've seen has been caused by water or lack of water, usually because of more water. Grounds. Here's a quick tip. How many of you know somebody who puttered around, maybe a parent, puttered around the house, the yard? Yes. Putters. Putters are good. I encourage you to become a putterer. Putterers, what they do is they walk around the grounds and they like pull on things, touch things. And usually when you're puttering around, you see things that you wouldn't have normally seen around corners of your house, fences, etc., that are weak. So we want to talk about soil grading. We're looking at ground. We want to talk about trees and vegetation. It's very bad to have trees and vegetation growing right against the foundation wall. I encourage you to just chop them and continually cut them until they die and you just have roots, because I've seen like the Bugs Bunny effect, no joke, trees growing up on the side and then the roots creating these channels in the concrete floor, like Bugs Bunny, you know, when you travel through the ground. And that's how bad it can be. So you don't want to have trees right up against the foundation, but they're good to also take moisture out of the ground. So there's good and bad. You also want to make sure that your sewer clean out is cleaned out every whatever it takes, a few years. Sometimes you'll open it up and have a sewer guy come and clean it, and there might be nothing to clean. But what they do is they basically snake it, because the sewer gets roots that grow into them and then basically clogs up the drain. And you don't want to have that, because then you have a sewer backup problem. Fences, basic, right? You want to look at those. And sump pump discharge. We talked about that, the hose. Very important to have it pointed away from the house. Here's me. This is at one of the houses next to one of Luis's places. It's a townhouse, and here I'm putting in a window well. If you have a house where you have the ground pretty level to the base of the window, what can happen is in a heavy rain, you can have water that can seep through underneath the frame or through the window itself and cause a water problem. So these window wells, you can get them at most hardware stores. They're pretty cheap. All you have to do is just dig them and then plant them in, and sometimes we put gravel or a PVC pipe and dig it down. But the point is, water can go into this and fill up before it gets into the window. That's the whole idea, is to get water away from the window. Here's an example. Now this might be yours too, Lisa. Yes, yeah. Wow. Lisa, sold our great house. This is an example of mud rucking. Now mud rucking isn't a verb, it's the name of a company called Mud Ruckers. But what it is sometimes when the concrete path or driveway starts to buckle in or out, people will think they just need to replace it, like take it all out and redo it. These are holes that a Mud Ruckers type company would have drilled in and actually put in some sort of liquid material that hardens to lift up the concrete to make it what it was. And so you can see it looks fantastic now. You have a little bit of, you can notice those little circles, but you don't have cracks and you don't have problems with grading. HVAC, furnace filters. There's no set rule. Some HVAC people say 3 months, every month, every 4 months. I would say you got to look at them regularly, make sure you have proper airflow. How are we for time?
Pretty good.
Okay, you sure? Good. Okay, and then we should talk about exhaust and draining of HVAC. When you have, we're over.
No, just
4 minutes. When you have a high efficiency furnace, there's no need for a chimney anymore. Okay, because you have those 2 pipes going out the side of the wall. And so what sometimes happens is people will still have a gas hot water tank that would have shared the older furnace exhaust through the chimney. What happens though is if you've replaced your furnace with a newer one, sometimes there's not enough heat pressure to take the exhaust out of the house. So it can actually melt the top of your hot water tank if it's natural gas. So what's usually recommended, what I recommend to people is if they're gonna change their furnace to a high efficiency one, maybe change then their hot water tank to an electric one and cap off that chimney because you don't need it anymore. Drainage has to do with the water draining from the furnace and the AC. Some people get pumps that will pump through a hose into the drain. Some people will just have a hose running on the ground. The point is you want to make sure the water gets into the drain, not on the floor. It's a good idea to drain and flush your hot water tank. It's very easy. If you go to see any hot water tank has a hose fitment on it, you just drain it and then you fill it with water by shutting it off and redoing it, and then you just continue that cycle till the water comes out clear. That's something you can do. Just depends how bad it gets. Some water is more minerally than others. You want to clean your AC, very simple. Never use chemicals on your AC. I did that once. I used a degreaser and it basically just eats the fins. The fins are like a thin aluminum. Yeah, you just use basic water and you use a light spray, and that's a great way to clean the fins of the air conditioner. Here is the dirtiest air filter I have seen in my career. Look at that. This house was for sale and it was during an open house and there was no one at the open house. I showed you this house. And I of course checked these filters. I'm weird. I checked it, and the furnace was actually struggling. It was like, and when I pulled it open, it was like, so this is an example of a really disgusting filter. This is what it's supposed to look like. This is actually Lisa's house. Wait, Lisa's getting a lot of filter. This is your filter, and look how clean it is. You don't want to use Filtrate either. Filtrate is way too restrictive, so don't buy Filtrate. That's my presentation.
nice.
We have a few minutes to spare.
Thank you.
When you're taking a listing,
Yes.
will you go through all that stuff with the seller?
Yes.
Especially that filter thing and say, by the way?
Absolutely. I showed a house where the upstairs vent was vibrating. And we didn't know what was going on. It was just like rocking. And I went downstairs and the filter was just clogged and restricted. And so, yeah, those types of things, like a buyer might walk in and go, what's wrong with the system? And all it is a filter. So absolutely. Basic maintenance. It's like buying a car. Right? Buyers are primed to look for certain things. Yeah, I would go through that with this seller.
We're trying to hang stuff in our house now, and Sean's concerned that we might have metal studs. Is there a
Right.
way to find out?
Yes, there is a stud finder tool. I might be dating myself, but it's like a little electronic box, and then it detects metal. And the whole idea of it was to look for screws or nails, so you don't hammer in or screw in the same spot. So you can get something like that. I believe it's magnetic, right? The studs aren't like an aluminum; they're just a steel. So if you get a stud finder,
Because we have a stud finder, but that's for wood, so you can get one specifically for metal.
well, you should be able to use the same one because it should just detect it because it's metal.
Right.
But another thing you can do is you can get screws that you screw in, and then there's a piece that goes like this, and then as you tighten it, it goes like this, and it basically tightens it from the back of the drywall plaster, and so you don't necessarily need a stud. So I would explore different types of anchors or screws if there's no way to use the stud, because obviously the stud you can't, right?
Right.
But I would explore that because I've used all kinds.
Can you explain me a little the difference between a vertical and horizontal crack? in the basement?
Yeah, it is a bit of a controversy because people usually think vertical cracks are worse, but horizontal cracks have the potential for more shifting. So a vertical crack is usually not an issue for shifting because where is the crack going to take the foundation? It can only go like this, right? Which is very unlikely. But a horizontal crack, it can cause if you're looking at the wall like up and down, it can go like this or like this. And that's the type of shifting we don't want. So generally, if there is a horizontal crack that spans a wall or it goes through a corner, those are things I would look for. Not necessarily for water, but for potential movement. And usually, you know this, of course, if you get the water away, usually that can just stop it from doing anything worse. And there's remedies to just seal the crack with resin or hydraulic cement, things like that. But the main thing is, why is there a crack? And fix that first. I wouldn't just jump to a foundation person, because sometimes it's just a little bit of pressure, and once you fix it, it doesn't get worse. I'm not a maintenance guy, but this is to show you the importance of taking care of your house. And I prepare my buyers and I let them know that if you can look at a house and figure out what kind of owner it is, you're in a good spot. And I talked about that last week in my 60-second. Just like a dog, if you look at the dog and it looks like the owner, that's usually the same thing with a house. So that's my presentation. That's true. It's well, generalization.
Okay, beautiful, thanks, Dave.